The afternoon lay heavy with red dust. The stagecoach rattled its way into the town as if it had been dragged there against its will, wheels groaning over the cracked dirt road. Heat shimmered above the ground, turning the horizon into a wavering line between earth and sky. The sun hung low, dull and unforgiving, staining everything the color of rust. When the coach finally lurched to a stop, silence followed, thick, expectant. Eliza Moore pressed her gloved hand against the wooden bench to steady herself. The journey had taken longer than she expected, longer than the letters had promised. In her other hand, she held the envelope she had unfolded and folded again until the edges softened and the ink blurred. It had spoken of land, of work, of a man who needed a wife and a home kept warm. It had not spoken of how it felt to arrive alone. The driver opened the door. "Copper Ridge," he called. Eliza stepped down. Her boots met the dirt with a small, final sound, as if the ground itself had acknowledged her arrival. She stood for a moment, letting the dust settle against her skirt, her skin, her breath. The town revealed itself slowly: weathered wooden buildings, a post office, a saloon with its doors half open, a church standing modestly at the far end of the street. And then the looks came. They were not loud or cruel. They did not need to be. Curiosity sharpened into caution, caution into judgment. Heads tilted, hands paused mid-task. A few whispers slid between people like dry leaves scraping the ground. A black woman, alone. Eliza adjusted her grip on the small travel bag, the only thing she owned that could still be called hers. She kept her chin lifted, her shoulders straight. She had learned long ago that shrinking only made the weight heavier. That was when she saw him. Caleb Hawthorne stood beside a double team of horses near the hitching post. He was taller than she expected, broader through the shoulders, his stance grounded and immovable, like the land itself had shaped him. The brim of his hat cast a shadow across his face, but she could still see the lines carved deep by sun and wind. His clothes were plain. His presence was not. He did not hurry toward her. He did not smile. He simply watched. The look was not hostile. It was not welcoming either. It was a measuring look, slow, deliberate, heavy with something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the life he carried. In her letters, she had imagined a man worn down by loneliness, perhaps softened by it. Someone grateful she had come. Someone who would meet her with relief, if not warmth. The man before her looked like someone who had forgotten what warmth felt like. Eliza took a breath and stepped closer. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. He removed his hat. The gesture was brief, restrained, as though politeness had become a habit he no longer examined. His eyes were pale, sharp, unsettlingly calm. "Miss Moore," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel pressed flat by years of use. She held out her hand. He took it for only a moment. His palm was dry, calloused, warm from the rains. Then he let go. Silence stretched between them. Wind moved down the street, rattling a loose sign above the post office. Caleb's gaze flicked to her bag, then back to her face. "You ready?" he asked. It was not an invitation. It was a decision already made. Eliza felt the weight of the town pressing in around her, the unspoken question of whether she belonged, whether she would last, whether she would break. She could still turn back. The coach had not yet pulled away. The road behind her remained open, stretching back toward everything she had survived and left behind. She thought of the narrow room she had slept in before, the counting of coins by candlelight, The promise she had made herself that she would stop running, even if stopping meant standing still in a place that did not want her. "Yes," she said quietly. Caleb replaced his hat and turned without another word. She followed. The wagon waited at the edge of the street. He climbed up first, settling onto the bench with practiced ease. When Eliza reached the wheel, he took her bag and stowed it behind him. No comment. No thanks. Just action. She climbed up beside him, careful with her skirt. For a brief moment, she was aware of the warmth radiating from his arm, the faint scent of leather and dust and smoke clinging to his clothes. She did not look at him. She did not trust herself to. The reins snapped lightly. The horses moved forward. Copper Ridge receded behind them, dissolving into a cloud of red dust and curious eyes. Ahead, the land opened wide and empty, the road winding into the fading light. Eliza folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. Whatever waited at the end of that road would not be easy. She knew that already. But she stayed. And beside her, Caleb Hawthorne said nothing, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on a horizon that had never once promised to be kind. The ranch revealed itself slowly, as if it had no interest in being admired. They crested a low rise and the land opened into a shallow valley where the house stood alone, square, solid, unadorned. A thin line of smoke rose from the stone chimney. 2 cottonwood trees flanked the porch, their branches bent permanently by wind. Beyond them lay a barn, a cattle pen, and a narrow stream cutting through the pasture like a dull ribbon of metal. Everything was in its place. Too much in its place. Eliza felt it before she named it. This was not a home shaped by comfort. It was a space shaped by control. Caleb pulled the reins and brought the wagon to a stop. He climbed down first, boots hitting the dirt with a decisive thud. He did not turn back to offer a hand. He simply said, "Get down." Eliza gathered her skirt and stepped carefully from the wheel. Her foot slipped for a moment, but she steadied herself without reaching for him. She would not begin by asking for help he had not offered. Her eyes moved over the yard. Chickens scratched near the fence. A bucket sat beside the well. The ground was swept clean of debris. Nothing here was careless. Nothing was warm. Caleb took her bag from the wagon and carried it toward the porch. Not gently, not roughly, just efficiently. He set it down near the door and turned to face her. "I wrote plain in my letters," he said. "I need someone who can keep a house. Cook, wash, mind the fire, tend the chickens." Eliza nodded. "I can learn," she replied softly. His jaw tightened, just enough for her to notice. "We'll marry," he said, "after I see you can do the work." The words fell into the air between them and stayed there. Eliza felt something inside her falter. Not break. She was too practiced for that. But bend. The image she had carried across miles of dust and rail and road shattered quietly, without sound. There would be no welcome, no shared meal to mark her arrival, no soft beginning, only conditions. "If that's what you wish," she said after a moment. Caleb did not answer. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and old pine. A rough-hewn table sat at the center with 2 chairs pushed neatly beneath it. Bowls were stacked on a shelf. The hearth held dying embers, gray and spent. There were no pictures on the walls, no flowers, no sign that anyone had ever lingered here longer than necessary. He pointed toward the narrow staircase. "You'll sleep up there. I'll stay down here." Eliza set her bag at the foot of the stairs and climbed slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The room above was small, low ceiling, narrow bed, a single window cracked open to the evening air. A gray wool blanket lay folded with careful precision. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Below her, Caleb's boots moved across the floor, back and forth, back and forth. The sound carried upward, steady and heavy, like a man pacing through something he did not know how to name. She removed her gloves and studied her hands. The skin was cracked from travel, darkened by sun, marked by work she had done and work she would do again. She flexed her fingers until the stiffness eased. This was not what she had imagined, but it was what she had chosen. Later, when darkness settled fully around the house, she lay back and stared at the ceiling. Wind slipped through the roof beams, whistling softly. The scent of ash drifted upward. Somewhere below, the fire stirred and died again. The silence was not gentle. It pressed in on her, dense and watchful, as if the house itself were waiting to see what she would do with it. She slept lightly and woke before dawn to the smell of cold ash. Sunlight was already spilling through the narrow window, turning floating dust into threads of gold. Eliza dressed quickly and descended the stairs. The hearth had gone out completely. On the table sat a single wooden bowl and a carving knife laid beside it. From outside came the steady clang of metal striking metal. Caleb was already working. She gathered kindling and tried to coax the fire back to life. The flame caught, then died. Caught again, then filled the room with smoke that burned her eyes and throat. She coughed, blinking through tears, and tried again. By the time she set the pot on the stove, her hands were shaking. Cornbread and salt pork. Simple enough. But the batter clung to her fingers, and the meat burned black at the edges. The smell grew thick and choking. Caleb stepped inside and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the stove, the smoke, the scorched pan. Eliza lowered her gaze. "I'll make it again," she said. He lifted the lid, studied the contents, then set it back down. "Don't burn the stove," he said flatly. "Out here, smoke means trouble." Then he turned and left. The door closed behind him, and the silence returned, sharper now, edged with shame. Eliza gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles ached. She did not cry. She would not give the house that satisfaction. If this was a test, she thought, breathing through the sting in her eyes, then she would endure it. Even if endurance was all she had to offer. The days that followed did not soften. They sharpened. Eliza rose before the sun each morning, while the sky was still pale and undecided, and the house held its breath in the cold. She moved quietly, as if sound itself might betray her. She swept the hearth, gathered kindling, coaxed flame the way she had watched others do it, carefully, patiently, trying to remember movements her hands had never truly learned. The fire flared too high. Smoke spilled into the room, thick and stinging, curling against the low ceiling. She choked back a cough and waved it away with her apron, eyes burning, jaw set. By the time the pot was on, the room already smelled wrong. Cornbread burned again. The bottom blackened before the middle could set. The salt pork sizzled too hot, grease snapping against the stone. She scraped what she could into a bowl and set it on the table anyway, knowing it would not be enough. Outside, the chickens scattered when she approached with the feed. She tossed the grain too close, then too far. They shrieked and flapped, feathers flying, chaos erupting where there should have been routine. Her heart raced as she chased them back toward the fence, skirt tangled around her legs, dust clinging to her skin. By midday, the fire had died again. She hauled the bucket to the well, wrapped the rope around her hands, and pulled. Halfway up, the rope snapped. The bucket plunged back down with a hollow splash, sending cold water spraying up at her face and chest. Eliza stood there, soaked, breathing hard, her hand a-trembling. Every task felt like proof of her inadequacy. Not because the work was impossible, but because failure seemed to arrive before effort could settle into skill. Caleb watched. He did not stand over her. He did not correct her or offer instruction. He simply observed from a distance, leaning against a post, pausing in his work, his eyes following each mistake with a calm that unsettled her more than anger ever could. That look stripped her bare. It made her feel as though every weakness she carried, the places she had never been taught, the things she had learned too late, were laid out plainly between them, as if he were not judging her, but recording her. At supper, he ate without comment. She sat across from him, hands tight around the wooden spoon, shoulders drawn in. The lamplight cast sharp shadows across his face, emphasizing every hard line. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain that she was trying. But the silence swallowed every word before it could rise. Pride was the last thing she still owned. That night, she climbed the stairs with aching muscles and lay awake long after the fire below had gone out. Wind pressed against the house, slipping through the seams in the walls. From outside came the slow tread of Caleb's boots moving across the porch. Then, faintly, she heard it. Metal striking metal. Once, then again. She sat up in bed, breath held, listening. The sound carried through the floorboards, measured, deliberate. A hammer, not angry, not hurried. The rhythm of someone fixing something that had broken. Eliza did not move. She watched the ceiling as pale strips of lamplight flickered across it, shifting with each strike. Her chest tightened with every sound. He was repairing the stove, the one she had nearly ruined, the one he had warned her about. He did not call up to her. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply worked. When the hammering finally stopped, the house fell back into silence, a deeper silence than before, one that held weight. Morning came quietly. Eliza descended the stairs to find the hearth cleaned, new bricks set in place, ashes swept away. The stove door closed properly now, snug and secure. No note, no word. But she knew. She stood there longer than necessary, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes tracing the careful work. The shame that had burned hot in her chest the day before cooled into something heavier, more complicated. Not kindness. Responsibility. At noon, Caleb returned from the field with dust streaking his shirt and sweat darkening the collar. He paused at the door, reached for the tin cup on the shelf, filled it from the bucket, and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. "It's hot." Their fingers brushed as she took it. Just a touch. Brief, unintentional. The cup trembled in her hand, and a few drops spilled onto the floor. She looked down quickly, embarrassed, but when she glanced back up, his expression had shifted, only slightly, but enough that she noticed. The hardness had eased at the edges. She nodded once. "Thank you." He returned the nod and stepped back outside as if nothing had passed between them. But when the door closed, Eliza leaned against the table, heart pounding in a way it had not since her arrival. That night, as lamplight again cast its quiet glow across the walls, She listened to his footsteps moving through the house. Slower now, careful, as though he were learning too, how to exist beside someone without breaking the fragile balance that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. It was not gentleness, not yet. But for the first time, Eliza understood something clearly. Caleb Hawthorne did not know how to show mercy, but he did know how to take responsibility. And in a place as harsh as this, that was not nothing. Change did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces so small, Eliza almost missed them. A tin cup of water held out without comment when the sun stood high and merciless. A gate caught and held open just long enough for her to pass through without struggling. A single word, so quiet she wondered if she had imagined it, murmured as he took a plate from her hands. "Thank you." The sound of it stayed with her longer than it should have. She did not ask questions. She did not point out the difference. She had learned that naming fragile things too soon was a way of breaking them. Instead, she watched. Caleb Hawthorne was a man of habits, and habits told truths people never said aloud. Each morning, before the heat fully settled, he checked the horses, not with affection, but with attention. His hands moved along their flanks and bridles, fingers tracing leather and muscle with the same steady care. He spoke to them rarely, but when he did, his voice softened in a way she never heard indoors. Before every ride, he tested the reins, once, twice, pulling hard, then easing the tension. He did not trust what had not been proven. In the evenings, when the light thinned and shadows stretched long across the yard, he locked the kitchen door and checked the stove. Every night, without fail. He made sure the fire was dead, the embers cold, the latch secure, as if some old memory stood watch inside him, whispering warnings he could never quite forget. Eliza found herself timing her movements to his. She learned when to step aside, when to pass behind him, when to speak, and when silence would carry more meaning. They moved around each other carefully, like two people navigating a narrow room without colliding. Fear loosened its grip. In its place came curiosity. One afternoon, she brought him water while he tightened a fence post. The sun burned down on his shoulders, darkening the fabric of his shirt. She held the cup out, and he took it, their fingers brushing again, longer this time. Neither of them moved away immediately. He drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then handed the cup back. "Gate sticks," he said, nodding toward the far end of the yard. "Lift it before you pull." She nodded. "I will." It was advice, not instruction. The difference mattered. Later, when she tested the gate, she did as he said. It opened smoothly, without protest. She smiled to herself, small and private, then quickly smoothed the expression away. That night, as she cleared the table, Caleb reached for a plate she was still holding. Their hands met. He hesitated, then took it gently from her grasp. Their eyes lifted at the same moment. The look they shared lasted no longer than a breath. But in it, Eliza felt something settle, not certainty, not hope, but recognition, as if they were both aware that the space between them was no longer empty. After that, she noticed how tired he was. Not the kind of tired that came from labor alone, but a deeper weariness, etched into the way his shoulders sloped when he thought no one was watching. The way he sometimes sat at the table long after the meal was finished, staring at nothing, hands folded as if holding himself together. This was not cruelty. This was exhaustion from carrying silence too long. She saw it in the way he paused before entering a room, as though bracing himself for whatever waited inside. In the way he slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. In the careful distance he maintained, even as he allowed himself to stand closer than before. One evening, she caught him watching her. She was kneading dough at the table, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her hands and forearms. The work required patience, pressure, release, movements she was only beginning to understand. She felt his gaze before she saw him. When she looked up, he did not turn away. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not desire, not judgment, something quieter. He cleared his throat and stepped back, picking up his coat. "I'll be out back," he said. After he left, Eliza leaned her palms against the table, heart beating faster than the work had earned. She was no longer afraid of him. That realization startled her more than anything else. Fear had kept her alert, prepared, braced for harm. Without it, she was left with something far more dangerous, hope that asked nothing but attention. Days passed in this way. No declarations, no sudden warmth, just a steady accumulation of moments that softened the hard edges of the house. Eliza began to move with more confidence. The fire obeyed her more often than not. The bread rose. The chickens settled when she approached. Small victories, quietly earned, and Caleb noticed. He did not praise her, but he no longer watched as if waiting for failure. That night, as she climbed the stairs, she heard him below, locking the door, checking the stove, moving through the house with familiar care. His footsteps no longer sounded like a challenge echoing through the floorboards. They sounded like someone learning how to share space. Lying in bed, Eliza stared at the ceiling and let herself acknowledge the truth she had been skirting all day. Something was growing here, not loudly, not safely, but steadily. And for the first time since stepping down from the stagecoach, she did not wonder whether she would endure. She wondered what it might cost her to stay. The door to Caleb's room was never fully closed. It stayed ajar just enough for the wind to push it open when it pleased, just enough to suggest that the space beyond was not meant to be entered, but not entirely forbidden either. Eliza did not mean to step inside. She had been looking for a sewing needle, her fingers already sore from mending a tear in her skirt. She checked the kitchen drawer, then the shelf near the hearth. When she passed the narrow hallway, the door shifted with a soft creak, revealing the room beyond. She hesitated. The house was quiet. Caleb was out with the horses. The afternoon light slanted low, spilling across the wooden floor in long amber bands. She stepped in. The room was spare, almost austere. The bed was neatly made, clothes folded with care, everything placed with intention, as though disorder were something that might invite disaster if allowed too close. Sunlight fell across a small wooden desk near the window. At its corner sat a tin box, old and dulled by time. The lid was not latched. Eliza told herself she would only look for the needle, nothing more. But her eyes were drawn to the box as if by gravity. She approached slowly, her footsteps barely stirring the dust. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied together with a frayed ribbon, once silver, now worn thin. The paper had yellowed, the edges curled. These were not recent. Her breath caught. She sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the first letter carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. "My dearest Caleb," it began. The handwriting was gentle, rounded, full of warmth. The words spoke of winter nights, of keeping the fire burning, of waiting for his return from the fields, of love that did not shout, but stayed. Eliza lowered the letter slowly, her chest tightening with a feeling she did not yet have a name for. On the wall above the desk hung a small photograph. A young woman stood beside a man she barely recognized. His face was softer there, his mouth curved into a smile Eliza had never seen. The woman's eyes were bright, kind, her hand resting easily against his arm. Caleb had loved before. Not lightly, not briefly. He had loved deeply enough to be altered by the loss. Eliza sat there longer than she should have, the late afternoon light bathing the room in gold, understanding settling over her like dust. This was not a man who had chosen emptiness. This was a man who had survived it. Footsteps sounded on the porch. Eliza moved quickly. She replaced the letters, lowered the lid, and stood just as Caleb stepped inside. He paused when he saw her, his gaze flicking to the desk, then to her face. "You looking for something?" he asked. "A sewing needle," she said truthfully. He pointed to the drawer beneath the desk. "There." She nodded, murmured thanks, and slipped past him, her pulse loud in her ears. Behind her, Caleb stood still for a long moment, his hand resting on the tin box, his expression unreadable. That evening they ate in silence again. But it was not the old silence. It carried weight, awareness. The oil lamp cast a soft circle of light across the table. Shadows shifted with each small movement. Eliza poured water into his cup. Her hand trembled, and a few drops spilled onto the wood. Without thinking, Caleb reached out and steadied the glass. His hand covered hers. The contact lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary. Neither of them moved. Eliza could feel the roughness of his skin, the warmth beneath it, the faint tremor that told her she was not the only one aware of what had just happened. Slowly, he released the cup, but his fingers lingered, brushing the back of her hand before withdrawing. She did not pull away. The line between them shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but it moved all the same, blurring the careful distance they had maintained since her arrival. Later, as she cleared the table, Caleb spoke again, his voice lower than usual. "You doing better with the stove?" She looked at him, surprised. "I'm learning." He nodded. "I can see that." The words settled between them, quiet and significant. That night, Eliza lay awake longer than usual. The house creaked softly around her. Below, she heard Caleb moving through his familiar routine, locking the door, checking the hearth, extinguishing the last ember. But when his footsteps passed beneath her room, they slowed, paused, then continued. In the darkness, Eliza pressed her palm against her chest, heart racing with something that was no longer fear. Compassion had taken root there, real and dangerous. It softened her toward him in ways she had not expected. She understood now why he held the world at a distance, and knowing that made her want to step closer, carefully. Not as someone who needed shelter, but as someone who saw the weight he carried and did not look away. By morning, the house would look the same. The land would stretch wide and indifferent. The work would wait. But something unseen had shifted. Two people, both carrying histories they had learned to hide, had begun, without words, without agreement, to stand nearer to one another than the roles they had been given were ever meant to allow. The evening arrived without ceremony. No wind stirred the yard. No dust rose from the road. The sky dimmed gently, as if even the land had decided to move more carefully. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp burned low, its light soft and steady, rounding the sharp corners of the room. Eliza sat at the table with a folded newspaper spread before her. She traced the lines of print with her eyes, lips moving faintly, the sounds breaking apart before they could become words. She did not hear Caleb come in at first. He stopped just inside the doorway. For a moment, he watched her the way he watched the land before a storm, quietly, attentively, without judgment. When she realized he was there, color rose in her cheeks. She reached to close the paper, embarrassed. "Leave it," he said. His voice was low, not firm, not distant. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. The space between them vanished. She could feel the warmth of him through the thin air, the solid presence of a body accustomed to work and silence. He leaned in, one hand resting lightly on the paper. "You were reading?" he asked. "Trying," she answered. "I know some words. Not many." He nodded as though this were simply another fact of the world to accept. His finger moved slowly across the line. "Drought," he read. "Threatens. Harvest." She repeated the words, halting but determined. He corrected her gently, once, twice. Their shoulders brushed. Neither pulled away. Time shifted. It slowed, thickened, settled around them like evening itself. "You shouldn't be ashamed," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I'm not ashamed I can't read. I'm ashamed I pretended I could." He was silent for a long moment. Then, just as quietly, he said, "I pretended I'd forgotten how to feel." Her breath caught. She turned toward him. Their faces were close enough now that she could see the small scar along his jaw, the exhaustion etched deep into his eyes. This man was not cold. He was guarded, armored by years of loss and duty and unspoken grief. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said. "I came to stay." He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted, as if a door long closed had finally been touched from the other side. His hand found hers on the table, rough fingers settling over her smaller ones, steady and warm. "If I kissed you now," he asked, his voice barely more than breath, "would you pull away?" She did not answer. She leaned in. Their lips met without urgency, without surprise. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, as though both were learning a language they had not spoken in years. It deepened slowly, not driven by want alone but by recognition. Hands moved with care, not searching, not claiming, simply confirming what was already there. He rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me to stop if you want me to." "Don't," she whispered. The word held everything. What followed was quiet and unhurried, the kind of closeness that did not rush toward proof, but lingered in the simple truth of being held. The lamp's glow softened the room, shadows swaying along the walls as though the house itself were breathing with them. They moved together without sound, without spectacle. Two people who had learned to endure, finally allowing themselves to rest. Later, when the night had settled fully and the lamp burned low, Eliza lay against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin. His arm rested around her, not possessive, just present. She listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart and felt her own answer it. In the darkness, she spoke softly. "There's something you don't know about me." He did not open his eyes. "I know," he said. "I'll wait until you're ready." The words loosened something inside her. She smiled faintly, though her chest tightened with the weight of what still lay ahead. Outside, the land rested under the stars. No wind, no dust, no sound but the distant call of a night bird and the quiet settling of the house. Caleb's breathing slowed. His hand moved absently along her back, a grounding touch, as if reassuring himself she was real. Eliza closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him sink into her bones. For the first time since stepping down from the stagecoach, she felt unguarded. Not because the world had grown kind, but because, for one night, neither of them had needed armor. This was not a promise, not a solution. It was something rarer and more fragile, a moment of truth shared between two people who had survived long enough to recognize it when it finally arrived. And in the stillness of that night, the cold places inside them began, at last, to thaw. Morning arrived quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what had taken shape in the dark. The first light crept through the narrow window and traced a pale line across the bed. Eliza woke before she moved, aware of warmth at her back, of the steady weight of an arm resting lightly at her waist. Caleb lay behind her, breathing slow and even, his presence so near it startled her. For a moment she let herself stay still. The house no longer felt hollow. The familiar creaks and sighs of settling wood sounded different now, less like warning, more like acknowledgement. Outside, a rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. The world was going on, unchanged, and yet nothing was the same. Caleb stirred. His hand shifted, brushed her hip, then settled again, careful even in sleep. When his eyes opened, he did not speak. He simply looked at her. The look held no hunger, no urgency, only something quieter. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for the briefest moment before he drew back. Then he rose, dressing with the familiar rhythm of a man who had done so every morning of his life. Belt fastened, shirt smoothed, boots pulled on. "I'll be at the stables," he said. Not distant, not tender, just real. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Eliza sat up slowly, the warmth of his body still pressed into the bedding beside her. She reached out without thinking and touched the place where he had lain. The blanket was already cooling. Her chest tightened. Fear crept in, not the sharp fear she had known before, but something deeper and more unsteady. Fear born not of danger, but of attachment. Last night had been a gift, a rare one, and gifts, she knew, could be taken back. She dressed and went about her chores with a carefulness that bordered on reverence. The fire caught easily this time. The kettle warmed. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her thoughts stayed tangled. Every sound made her glance toward the door. Every footstep outside set her heart racing, only to settle again when it passed. When their eyes met later that morning, there was no coldness in his. But there was caution. A gentler version of distance, as if both of them were learning how to stand on unfamiliar ground. The closeness they had shared had opened something fragile between them, and fragile things could break. By midday, clouds gathered low over the fields, muting the light. Eliza stood at the table, kneading dough, the familiar motion grounding her. She focused on the pressure of her palms, the rise and fall of breath. There was something she carried that did not belong to this morning, something that could not remain unspoken forever. The truth pressed against her ribs like a living thing. She had told herself she would speak before this, before closeness made honesty dangerous. But now that he had held her, kissed her, known her without judgment, the words felt heavier. She had crossed too many miles on silence to pretend she did not know how secrets ended. Caleb came in from the field in the early afternoon, dust streaking his shirt, his hair darkened with sweat. He paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment longer than usual. When he stepped inside, he moved with care, as though the space between them might bruise if handled roughly. "You need help with that?" he asked, nodding toward the dough. She shook her head. "No, I've got it." He accepted that without argument and moved to fill his cup at the bucket. The small, ordinary exchange felt strangely intimate. They ate in near silence, not the heavy silence of before, but something watchful, expectant, as if both were listening for a sound they could not yet name. Eliza studied his hands as he ate, strong, steady, scarred by work and weather. These were the hands that had repaired her mistakes without comment, the hands that had held her with care the night before. The thought made her throat tighten. She wanted to reach for him, to anchor herself in the certainty of touch. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stayed still. That evening, when the light thinned and shadows lengthened, the fear settled fully into her bones. The house was too quiet, the peace too new. She stood by the window and watched the land stretch wide and indifferent, just as it had the day she arrived. Nothing here promised permanence. Love, she knew, was not a shield. It was a risk. Caleb passed behind her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him without contact. He hesitated, then rested his hand briefly against her shoulder. Just a touch. Just enough. Her breath caught, and he withdrew, as if realizing too late how much that small gesture might mean. That was when she understood. The danger was no longer in being rejected. The danger was in being known, and losing what had only just begun. She closed her eyes and drew a steadying breath. Soon she would have to speak. And when she did, the quiet life she had finally touched might fracture under the weight of truth. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind rise beyond the walls, Eliza held herself still and wondered which fear was greater, the fear of being left, or the fear of staying long enough to lose everything again. The question came without warning. Late afternoon pressed against the windows, the light dulled by gathering clouds. The wind had begun to rise again, lifting dust from the yard and carrying it in restless spirals across the land. Inside the cabin, Caleb sat at the table, a worn leather notebook open before him, his pen moving slowly, deliberately, as if each word required thought. Eliza stood by the stove, a cloth in her hands she no longer needed. Her thoughts were far from the work. They had been circling the same place all day, tightening with every hour she did not speak. Caleb set the pen down. "You mentioned Philadelphia once," he said, not looking up. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Before you came out here, what was it like?" The words landed with more force than any accusation. Eliza's fingers clenched around the cloth. The room seemed to narrow, the air growing heavier with each breath. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it in 100 quiet ways. But preparation dissolved the instant she faced him. "Hard," she said softly. "Loud. Lonely." He nodded, as if accepting the answer, but he did not return to his writing. "What else, Bo?" he asked. The silence that followed stretched thin and sharp. The fire popped once in the hearth. Smoke curled upward, faint and gray. Eliza drew a breath so deep it hurt. "There's something you should know," she said. Caleb finally looked at her, not with suspicion, not with anger, with attention. She forced herself to keep going. "Before I left," she said, each word deliberate, "I had no money, none at all." His expression did not change. "A man offered to help me," she continued, her voice unsteady now despite her effort to keep it firm. "I took what he offered." She swallowed hard. "I sold myself once," she said, "just once, to buy the ticket that brought me here." The words fell into the room and stayed there. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as though listening. Caleb did not speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Eliza waited for something. Disgust, anger, judgment. She had learned to survive those. What she had not learned to survive was silence like this. Slowly, Caleb stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a small sound that filled the room. "I need some air," he said. His voice was rough now, strained as if dragged through gravel. He took his coat from the peg, pulled it on, and walked to the door without looking at her. When he opened it, the wind surged in, scattering ash from the hearth and stirring the lamp's flame until it bent sideways. Then he was gone. The door shut behind him. Eliza remained where she stood, her hands falling uselessly to her sides. Her pulse pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She lowered herself into the chair he had left and folded her hands in her lap, gripping them tightly as if to keep herself from coming apart. She did not cry at first. She had always known this truth would cost her something. She had just hoped, quietly, foolishly, that this time it might not cost her everything. Through the window, she saw him in the distance, walking into the wind, his coat whipping behind him, his figure growing smaller with each step. The sight tore something open inside her chest. That night, she did not light the lamp. Darkness settled early, heavy and complete. The wind battered the house, slipping through every crack and seam, making the boards groan and the fire falter. Eliza lay awake on the narrow bed, staring into the blackness, listening for footsteps that did not come. Caleb did not return. She knew because the house never changed its rhythm. No door opened, no boots crossed the floor, no quiet movements below her room. Morning crept in gray and soundless. When she finally rose, the hearth was cold, the table empty, the space beside her untouched. Outside, the yard looked wider than it had the day before, the tracks from the wagon deepened by damp earth and wind. Eliza stood by the window and let the truth settle fully inside her. There were things love could survive, and there were truths that did not destroy love, but destroyed the illusions built around it. She had not lied to him, but she had shattered the version of her he might have hoped for, and perhaps the version of himself he had been clinging to just as tightly. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep into her skin. Whatever came next, she understood one thing with painful clarity. This was no longer a matter of endurance. It was a matter of whether truth, once spoken, could ever be carried back inside without breaking everything it touched. The decision did not arrive in a rush. It settled slowly, like damp seeping into wood. Eliza woke before dawn, the sky still heavy and unformed beyond the narrow window. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before, not watchful, not tense, just empty. She lay still for a long moment, listening, knowing what she would not hear. No footsteps below, no breath moving through the room beside hers, no presence answering her own. She rose without ceremony and dressed by the thin gray light, folding each piece of clothing with care, the same care she had learned to use everywhere else. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. Each movement felt like a small closing of a door. She reached beneath the bed and pulled out the travel bag. The leather was worn soft by miles of use. It held everything she had brought to this place and would now carry everything she would take away. When the last garment was folded, she sat on the edge of the bed and rested her hands on the bag, fingers still. She did not cry. She had already spent her tears in the long night out that had followed his leaving. What remained was quieter and steadier, a clarity she had earned the hard way. Downstairs, the kitchen waited in the dim half-light. The table stood exactly as they had left it days ago. The hearth was cold. The chair where Caleb had sat the afternoon before remained pushed back, as if he might return at any moment and take it again. She did not touch anything. Eliza took a scrap of paper from the drawer and found the pencil she used only when necessary. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, the letters slanting unevenly across the page. 2 words. I'm sorry. No explanation. No plea. No defense. She placed the note on the table beside his ledger, where he would see it without effort. A draft slipped through the open window and lifted the corner of the paper, making it flutter briefly before settling again. Outside, the sky darkened. Rain began as a whisper, fine and cold, then strengthened quickly, tapping against the roof, streaking down the window in uneven lines. The wind followed, sharp and insistent, pushing through the valley as if urging her on. Eliza lifted the bag and walked to the door. She paused there, hand resting on the latch, and looked back once. The house stood solid and unchanged. Smoke still curled faintly from the chimney, proof that life would continue here, just not with her. She stepped onto the porch. The rain struck her face immediately, cold and cleansing. Her skirt darkened as it soaked through. Her hair came loose from its tie, strands clinging to her cheeks and neck. The yard felt wider than ever before. She crossed it slowly, each step sinking into the softening earth. Mud pulled at her shoes, reluctant to let go. The gate creaked as she opened it, the sound loud in the empty morning. At the edge of the property, she stopped. Far across the field, she saw him. Caleb moved through the rain near the stables, leading a horse, head bent, against the wind. He did not look up. He did not see her standing there, small and still against the gray sweep of land. For a moment, Eliza thought of calling out. Just once. But the words lodged in her throat and refused to rise. Whatever she might have said would not change what had already been done. Some distances were crossed only one way. She turned and walked on. The rain thickened, blurring the land into shades of gray and brown. Thunder cracked somewhere beyond the ridge, distant but heavy with promise. The wind gathered behind her, pushing at her back as if the world itself had decided she must keep moving. Each step felt like leaving something behind. Not just the house, not just the man, but the version of herself that had allowed hope to take root here. Her feet carried her forward anyway. When she reached the rise beyond the cottonwoods, she looked back once more. The ranch had already begun to fade into the rain, reduced to a dark shape against the storm. A drop of water struck her cheek. Cold. Sharp. She could not tell where the rain ended and her tears began. By the time she turned away again, the house was gone from view. Inside the cabin, the note lay on the table, the ink slowly smearing as moisture crept in through the open window. The wind lifted it once more, as if trying to say what neither of them had managed aloud. Sorry. Out in the open field, Eliza Moore walked on, shoulders squared, head lifted, carrying nothing but her bag and her dignity. She did not beg. She did not curse. She did not look back again. This was the second pain, the deeper one. Not the pain of being rejected, but the pain of choosing to leave with herself intact, even when staying might have been easier. And as the storm closed in behind her, she understood something with calm, devastating certainty. Some loves were lost, not because they were false, but because truth demanded a courage not everyone was ready to claim. The house did not change when Eliza left. That was what struck Caleb first. The walls stood where they always had. The table remained centered beneath the lamp. The hearth held the same cold ash. Nothing had been overturned. Nothing broken. No sign of departure beyond the quiet itself. And yet the absence pressed in on him like a weight. He came in from the rain with mud clinging to his boots and water darkening the shoulders of his coat. He did not hang it up right away. He stood just inside the door, listening to nothing. No movement upstairs. No soft sound of work in the kitchen. No breath other than his own. The house felt as though it had never known another person. Caleb moved slowly, as if the air itself had thickened. He crossed to the table and saw the paper there, resting beside his ledger. 2 words. Uneven. Familiar. I'm sorry. He stared at them for a long time. The lamp flickered, its flame bending each time the wind slipped through the seams of the walls. Outside, rain beat steadily against the roof, relentless and patient. He sank into the chair opposite where Eliza had so often sat. The wood creaked beneath his weight. The sound echoed too loudly in the empty room. For years, he had believed he knew what strength looked like. It was order, control, clean lines and clear rules, a life scrubbed of excess and complication. He had told himself that grief could be managed the same way land could, fenced, measured, kept in check. Mary's face rose unbidden in his mind. Her laughter. The way she had flour-dusted hands and still touched his cheek without thinking twice. How easily she had lived beside imperfection. When she and their child were buried beneath the cottonwoods, he had decided something without ever speaking it aloud. Love must be pure, untouched, uncomplicated. Anything else was a risk he could not survive again. And then Eliza had arrived, scarred, honest, carrying her life openly, without apology. She had not pretended her past did not exist. She had survived it, and walked forward anyway. He closed his eyes. While she lived by truth, he thought bitterly, I hid behind cleanliness and called it virtue. The realization landed hard and sharp. He had not walked away because she had sold herself once. He had walked away because she had dared to stand before him without armor, and in doing so had exposed how carefully he had wrapped his own fear in rules and silence. Caleb stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. He crossed the room in long strides, pulled on his coat, and grabbed his hat. The rain had not lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier, the wind pushing it sideways in cold sheets. He stepped outside. The storm hit him full in the face, sharp and unrelenting. Mud sucked at his boots with every step. Lightning cracked open the sky, briefly illuminating the fields in stark silver and black. He did not hesitate. He moved through the rain with purpose, his breath coming hard, his chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to regret. The land opened wide before him, unforgiving and vast. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their branches thrashing wildly, leaves torn loose and scattered by the wind. If she had gone this way, she could not have gone far. He pushed on. Every step brought memory with it, the way she had stood at the stove, stubborn and trying, the quiet pride in her eyes when she succeeded, the warmth of her body beside his in the dark, trusting him with what little safety she had left. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. "Pure is easy," he said aloud into the storm. "Brave is not." The words tasted like truth. When he reached the stand of cottonwoods, his chest ached, his clothes soaked through. He slowed, scanning the land through the shifting veil of rain. Then he saw her, a small figure standing against the wind, her travel bag at her feet, her dress soaked through, hair loose and dark against her face. She stood still, as if rooted to the ground, lifted toward the storm rather than away from it. Caleb stopped a few paces from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain fell hard between them, loud enough to drown out the rest of the world. He had chased storms before, hail, drought, loss, but never anything that frightened him like this. "If you leave," he said finally, his voice roughened by wind and everything he had not said soon enough, "I'll be alone again." Eliza's gaze did not waver. Her voice, when she answered, was calm and devastating in its simplicity. "You already are." The truth struck clean. He took a step closer, mud pulling at his boots, rain streaming down his face. The measuring distance was gone now. What remained was choice. "I thought I needed someone untouched to begin again," he said slowly. "But what I needed was someone brave enough to stay when things were ugly." She looked down, her hands curling briefly at her sides. "I don't want your pity." "It isn't pity," he said, his voice breaking at the edges. "It's regret, for not seeing what was standing right in front of me." Lightning split the sky. Caleb extended his hand, palm open, unguarded. "Stay," he said. "Let's start where the truth is." The wind tore through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of wet earth and something like forgiveness. And in that storm, with the world stripped bare around them, the man who had stayed behind finally learned how to walk forward. The storm eased before the choice did. Rain thinned to a steady fall, then to a quiet drip from the leaves above them. The wind loosened its grip on the cottonwoods, their branches settling into a restless hush. What remained was the sound of breath, of water sinking into earth, of two people standing close enough now to feel the weight of what came next. Caleb did not reach for her again. He had already said what mattered. Eliza stood with her hands clenched at her sides, rain sliding down her face, her dress heavy against her legs. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked, at the lines carved by years of restraint, at the exhaustion he no longer tried to hide, at the quiet resolve in his eyes that had not been there before. This was not a man pleading. This was a man choosing. "I don't need someone perfect," he said, his voice steady now, stripped of urgency. "I need someone who stays when the truth is hard to look at." He did not promise happiness. He did not promise ease. He offered presence. Eliza's breath shuddered as she let the words settle. For so long, she had been measured by what she lacked, by what she carried, by what she had done to survive. Standing there in the damp quiet, she realized this was the first time anyone had asked her to stay, not because she was useful, but because she was honest. Slowly, deliberately, she bent and lifted the handle of her bag. Then she set it down. The motion was small, almost ordinary, but it carried the weight of every mile she had walked, every night she had endured, every truth she had learned to carry without apology. Caleb did not smile. He did not need to. They walked back together beneath the thinning rain, not touching, not speaking, their steps falling into an easy rhythm, as if the land itself had accepted the decision. The ranch came into view, the house standing solid against the gray sky, unchanged, and yet no longer empty. Inside, they dried themselves in silence. He poured water. She hung her dress near the hearth. Their movements were careful, familiar, unafraid. Nothing needed to be said to seal what had already been chosen. They married 2 days later. There was no announcement, no invitation, no celebration to soften the edges of what the town would see. Word traveled anyway, as it always did. By the time they walked into Copper Ridge together, heads turned and whispers followed, sharp and curious. She kept her gaze low. Caleb did not. The church was small, its wooden walls darkened by years of weather. Light filtered through the narrow windows in pale streaks, catching dust in the air. Reverend Holt paused when he saw them, surprise flickering briefly across his face before he nodded them forward. The ceremony was short enough to fit inside a breath. No flowers, no music, no speeches meant to convince anyone watching, just two people standing side by side. When it was finished, Caleb turned toward her, his hand finding hers. His grip was firm, unyielding, as if to say what words could not. "This is my wife," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the quiet room. The words settled like a line drawn in the sand. No one answered. Some faces remained stiff. Others looked away. A few, only a few, met his gaze and nodded once, slow and thoughtful. Outside, the rain had stopped. The road back to the ranch was damp and darkened, wagon tracks cutting deep into the earth. They walked together in silence, the town receding behind them, the land opening wide ahead. When they reached the porch, Caleb stepped up first, then turned and held out his hands. Eliza hesitated only a moment before placing her own in his. He lifted her gently, as though there were no one else in the world watching. The door creaked open. Light spilled into the house, touching the familiar walls, the worn floorboards, the place where everything had begun and nearly ended. Nothing inside had changed. Everything had. That evening, they ate together quietly. No talk of the past. No plans for what came next. Just the soft sounds of cutlery against plates. The warmth of shared space. The unspoken understanding that this was not an ending. It was a beginning built on choice. Later, when the house settled into night and the wind moved gently through the cottonwoods, Eliza lay beside him and listened to his breathing even out. She rested her head against his shoulder and let herself believe, just for a moment, that staying did not have to mean surrender. It could mean courage. And in that small wooden house beneath a sky scrubbed clean by rain, two people who had been broken in different ways chose, quietly, deliberately, not to walk away again. Time did not pass in dates or numbers. It moved by seasons, by winters that came early and stayed longer than promised, by summers that burned the fields gold and left their hands blistered and darkened, by springs that returned quietly, coaxing green from soil that had learned patience the hard way. Eliza learned the rhythm of it without ever naming it. She learned that some mornings began with laughter, others with silence, and most with the simple work of living side by side. The house changed slowly, repairs made before things broke, shelves added where there had once been bare walls, a table worn smooth by years of shared meals. 2 children came into that life. The first arrived during a winter so gentle it surprised them both. Snow fell in light, steady sheets, softening the world beyond the windows. Caleb paced the floor through the night, his hands useless, his face drawn tight with a fear he had never learned to master. When the child finally cried, sharp and alive, he sank into the chair and covered his face with his hands. Eliza watched him then, exhausted and trembling, and understood something without words. This was a man who had once believed love was something that could be kept clean by distance. Now he held it with shaking hands. The second child came 2 years later, in early summer, when the land was loud with life. By then, Caleb knew how to wait. He stood near the door, listening, trusting the strength of the woman who had already taught him what endurance looked like. Their children grew as the land did, scraped knees, sun-warmed skin, laughter echoing across the yard. The house that had once felt like a test became something steadier, shaped not by rules, but by repetition. Eliza found her place in the town without announcing it. It began with one child sitting beside her on the steps behind the general store, curious about the chalk marks she made on a scrap of board. Then another, and another. Soon children came after their chores, shoes dusty, eyes bright, voices loud with questions. She taught them letters first, then words, then patience. She taught them that reading was not about speed or perfection, but about staying with something until it made sense. Parents watched from a distance at first, wary and quiet. Over time, they began to nod in greeting. Some offered bread. Others brought small slates or extra chalk. Caleb never interfered. Sometimes, riding back from the fields, he stopped his horse at the edge of the road and watched. He did not call out. He did not step closer. He simply sat there, reins loose in his hands, observing the small figure of his wife kneeling among the children, her voice calm and steady. The look in his eyes held everything he did not say. They did not speak often of the past. There were moments in the quiet of evening when it pressed close, when grief rose without warning, when fear sharpened old instincts. Once, during a hard year when the creek ran low and tempers wore thin, his voice lifted louder than he meant it to. Eliza stood on the porch, her chin raised, her voice level. "I won't make myself small to keep the peace." The words stopped him cold. That night, he worked late in the barn, hammering in silence. When he came back, she was still awake, mending a tear in his work shirt. She did not scold. He did not apologize. She handed him the shirt. Their fingers brushed. That was enough. They learned over time that love was not the absence of conflict. It was the refusal to leave when conflict arrived. It was the choosing, again and again, to remain present, even when silence would have been easier. Years folded into one another. Fields expanded. Fences were rebuilt. The children grew taller, louder, more sure of themselves. On warm evenings, the family sat on the porch and watched the land darken under the wide sky. Caleb leaned back, Eliza beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. Sometimes she counted the seasons aloud. Sometimes she did not. On the 7th winter, snow returned softly, settling on the roof and the cottonwoods beyond. They sat together, wrapped in quiet, watching the land they had shaped and been shaped by in return. "It's been years," Eliza said gently. Caleb nodded. His hand tightened around hers, warm and certain. "Feels like we're still choosing." She smiled at that. There were no grand promises left to make. They had learned that love did not announce itself with vows or declarations. It revealed itself in smaller ways, through staying, through kindness practiced daily, through the courage to remain visible even when the world looked hard. As the snow began to melt, water dripping in slow, clear drops from the eaves, Eliza looked up at him, her voice quiet as the wind moving through the cottonwoods. "We made it," she said. He did not answer. He only nodded once. And that was enough, because staying was never luck. Staying was a choice, made once and then made again every single day of a lifetime. If this story touched a memory, or stirred a quiet feeling you thought time had buried, we invite you to share it in the comments below. Your stories matter. They always have. If you found warmth here, please press like to support this channel. And if you would like to continue walking with us through gentle, slow-burn stories about love, resilience, and choosing one another through the years, please subscribe. Thank you for staying with us until the final lines. Some choices change a day. Others shape a lifetime.